Hello everyone, I'm Grandmaster Denes Boros, and today I'm going to show you how to think like a Grandmaster, solve positions. So let's take a look at this puzzle. So when you look at this position, you have to look for patterns. Patterns are methods of just chunking up ideas that you already know. So one of the first things that I would look for is looking for some forward patterns, such as sacrificing my queen, as I believe that there could be some potential tricks my opponent's king there. So if takes, there is no bishop f8 because if rook takes d5, and I gained an extra pawn, which is not so bad for a position. However, if there is a rook f8, I do get to win this bishop. I do lose my rook on e4, and I'm losing. So the first things first, I do look for patterns, even if they're wrong. That's the first thing I look for. So I say, hey, maybe a pattern like this could work. Then I move on to the next one if that just doesn't seem to fizzle out, and that seems to fizzle out in general. Now, I always check if there's any loose pieces for me as the one who's playing white or my opponent. I do have a couple of loose pieces. There's an a2 pawn loose, a rook on d7 hanging, my bishop attack, pressure on the rook, plenty of things happening. So I've got to be mindful of all that if I don't happen to have a decisive attack in this position. So I started off with patterns. So first things first, you want to look for patterns. So rook takes f7 is not doing anything spectacular. That would just be captured. So I wouldn't really calculate that too much. But queen f7 was interesting. That could potentially be a winning idea, pattern that I've known from the past. But then I look for pattern number 2, the windmill. That would be rook g4 going after this king. Let's see, rook g4. Now, first question, can they just take the rook? They take the rook, I can take here, king here, and this looks bad. For rook takes f7, there is bishop e5, and there is no immediate checkmate. However, white does have this beautiful tactical idea of rook g8 check, takes queen g4, and it is mate on the board. In fact, there would be another solution of taking check, check, and mating. So this would be like a first good step. I'd say, okay, rook g4 definitely is on the map. One of the lines does win for me, so that is a great start. So I go back to rook g4. And of course, I do this in my head. I'm not going to play those moves. I'm trying to visualize them. So question number 2, what happens if queen takes to f3? Now, I cannot capture back. My rook is hanging on d7. I don't really trust that. So the only line that could make sense is go rook takes g7, king here. And this is the moment I'd start thinking, if I could get this rook over to h7, that would be checkmate, right? Because the king really doesn't have any places to go to. So I would think about something like rook takes f7. And if king g8, that would actually work, because check, check here, and it's mate. However, there is one little problem, actually quite a big one. There is this move of bishop takes e5, not only stopping that check, but after rook takes h7, this square is actually covered by the bishop. So even though this pattern seemed very promising, it does feel to fall short to this bishop takes e5 and later on bishop takes g7 idea. If you bring your rook over there, they just capture and you're down way too much material. And this is actually the first few steps I take when I'm calculating a position. I do look at moves that look promising but not necessarily good. So queen f7 would be one of the lines, but I kind of decided that's not likely to work. And I would still consider rook g4, which seemed much more promising than queen f7. And now I'm back to square one. I have to look for a different move. Now I did realize that this king is awfully alone while my pieces do be lurking over there. So there is an idea of going queen f6. And that's again not a move you'd consider full-heartedly, but you do feel that that's a pattern that could work. Because if queen f6, it's a taboo you can't capture. I check. Here, bishop takes f6. So this looks promising again because I have that mate. However, black does not have to take the queen. Black can take the rook and can take the bishop. So let's go one by one. Of course, rook takes d7 runs into queen g7 checkmate. That is no good. So we're left with bishop takes e5. Now, if pawn takes, then these rooks are hanging and it's just bad. There is no mate here, even though you can pin it. There's g6, or the more flashy check, check, queen takes g4, and g takes f6 wins the queen. Now, that means that even though queen f6 was interesting and almost there, winning, it didn't work because of bishop takes e5. So I looked at one, rook takes f7, rook g4, the second one, and the third one, queen f6. So now I would be wondering, okay, rook g4 definitely doesn't work. But what if I get rid of this defender? Go rook takes d6. Now, obviously, black has to capture back. Now again, I come back to the patterns that I've been using. I'm gonna check with rook g4 and queen f6. Also note that even though I use the patterns, I make sure to back it up with calculation. In this sense, chess is a lot like math. You've got to prove your point. It's not enough to have a hypothesis, which here is a pattern. You've got to prove that it does work. Now, rook g4 does look very tempting in this position. And after queen takes f3, there is takes on g7. Here, rook takes f7. Here, check. Here, rook here. But even after something like rook f6, it's not abundantly clear if you're just simply winning. Rook f6, there's queen takes f6, but of course there's bishop takes, rook takes. So this actually is promising because we've got some material advantage and the e-pawn is weak. So rook g4 is definitely on the map. Rook g4, however, after f6, it does not seem to be more than that. Bishop takes f6, queen takes f3. Rook takes, king there, and there is a potential. It looks like there's a potential, but really no, because queen takes f6 and you're losing. Alright, so rook g4 is out. Does that mean that rook takes d6 refutes this whole idea for the white player? And the answer is nay, because we didn't look at queen f6. And queen f6 actually looks very dangerous. We revisit the idea we had originally, no more bishop takes e5, but if you take, it's the same pattern and this is checkmate. There's no way of stopping that. So we're left with queen takes e5. Queen takes e5 would be interesting if for not queen takes e5 and you don't have that g takes f6 idea anymore. If queen e4, then takes g7, it's checkmate. So a little bit of a recap of what we did here. So we got this position. I used some patterns, sort of a hypothesis, to build up my ideas, but then I started what we call in chess lingo calculating and wondering how to find a way through. And I said, hey, rook g4 looked very promising. It fell short, but I kept in the back of my mind that it might be useful for later. It's something I can work with. Now then I went for rook takes d6, realizing that if I do get this queen f6 idea and there's no bishop takes e5, this wins on spot, and g takes f6 runs into this checkmate. So this is how you do use patterns and a bit of calculation all together. This is how you calculate as a grandmaster. So I hope you liked this video, and if you did, Do let me know what you enjoyed, if you'd like more of this content or something else, openings and such. And if you do, I do have videos on the Rockport Joe Bava and many other openings. In any case, like, subscribe, and see ya next time.